Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review.
Well, most of you never thought this day would come. We finally made it to the last day of 2020, and what a year it was. It was this year that Israel, along with the rest of the world, had to come to terms with COVID-19 flipping our lives upside down. Now, even though Israel is leading the vaccination race, it will still be a little bit longer until the world returns to what it once was. Let's find out how Israel is leaving 2020 behind in its race to stop the virus. Hannah Rifkin reports.
As Israel's coronavirus vaccination campaign enters its second week, the health ministry reported Thursday that almost 800,000 Israelis have been inoculated against the virus so far.
בצעדי ענק מחסנים את האוכלוסייה, אנחנו מובילים את כל העולם. משלים, אני חושב, את האוכלוסייה בסיכון, זה מעל גיל 60, אני מעריך שזה ייקח לנו בערך חודש ימים.
Keeping with the pace of 150,000 injections a day, the ministry reports that about 33% of the country's over 60 population has received the first of the needed 2 doses. Israel continues to lead the world in vaccinations per capita, with 7.74% of its population already inoculated.
ויגיעו גם חיסונים נוספים? זאת אומרת, מתי בערך מודרנה תתחיל להזרים לכאן את החיסונים?
קודם כל, אנחנו מדברים גם עם מודרנה הכי מאוחר, אנחנו מדברים על חודש מרץ, אבל אנחנו מקווים גם להקדים את מודרנה, ואפילו יש קצת הבנות אולי בנושא.
אנחנו נהיה במצב שעדיין לא חיסנו את כל האוכלוסייה, ונצטרך לקחת עוד כמה חודשים לעשות את זה, אבל זה יאפשר לנו לפתוח את המסחר ומסעדות וספורט וכל שאר הדברים שנותנים הרבה טעם לחיים.
Israel's COVID commissioner, Professor Nachman Ash, now warned that the country could face a shortage of COVID-19 vaccines if local authorities ignored health ministry regulations by administering the inoculation to those not considered eligible as of yet.
נותנים כמובן תעסוקה לכם ופרנסה לרבים בישראל. אנחנו משיגים הישג כביר. אנחנו מוציאים את ישראל ראשונה מהסגר בעולם. אנחנו נאפשר לכם לחזור לפעילות במהירות המרבית.
Here are the latest numbers. On Wednesday, the health ministry recorded 5,618 new cases, with a positive rate of 5.6%. 213 are in critical condition, with 170 on ventilators, and 3,318 Israelis have died from the virus. Still, Israel's prime minister vowing that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that the government will continue to do everything it can to help people survive, literally and financially.
אני יודע שעדיין קשה, אני יודע יש קשיים לבעלי עסקים שונים, קטנים ועד גדולים. אני יודע שהדבר הזה הוא לא פשוט ועברתם גם חוויה מאוד קשה. אני בטוח שאתם מבינים את זה, ואנחנו נפעל יחד, נעזור לכם בכל מה שאנחנו יכולים.
As Israel continues to experience the restrictions of a national lockdown, any sense of normal seems further than ever. Hannah Rifkin, ILTV.
Starting off tonight with a very long-awaited homecoming, the infamous Jonathan Pollard and his wife Esther starting a new life in Israel Wednesday morning. An emotional arrival. New immigrants to Israel, aka Olim, Jonathan Pollard and his wife Esther, kissing the Israeli ground upon touchdown, as so many other Olim do. They even kept Prime Minister Netanyahu waiting to do so. But unlike many others, the Pollards' landing at Ben Gurion Airport also marks one of the first truly free moments that Jonathan has enjoyed in several decades, following his imprisonment over charges of conspiracy to commit espionage.
We are ecstatic to be home at last, after 35 years. And we thank the people and the Prime Minister of Israel for bringing us home. No one could be prouder of this country or this leader than we are. And we hope to become productive citizens as soon and as quickly as possible to get on with our lives here. This is a wonderful country. It has a tremendous future. It is the future of the Jewish people, and we're not going anywhere. So thank you, profoundly thank you very much.
Thank you. Get some rest.
A former U.S. Navy analyst, Pollard was convicted in 1987 after pleading guilty to charges of passing American military intelligence onto the Israelis. the scandal causing a decades-long rift between the United States and Israel, and Pollard's sentencing being life in prison with chance for parole. Well, in 2015, after nearly 30 years in prison and extensive efforts to free him, Pollard was granted that parole, just under strict conditions, including wearing an ankle monitor, a ban from certain computer use, a daily evening curfew, and a ban on travel. That said, Pollard's parole has since been lifted, and his 5-year ban on travel was also now allowed to go unrenewed, in a move seen by some as a parting gift from the Trump administration, especially as the now 66-year-old Pollard has often spoken of his Zionism and his ambitions to move to Israel. As for Israel, authorities are happy to receive them, Prime Minister Netanyahu having expressed his intentions to help the Pollards months ago. In fact, the flight was a private one owned by Netanyahu's American billionaire friends, the Adelsons, allegedly due to Esther's cancer-caused health concerns. And as they arrived, Netanyahu personally greeted them, handed them their new ID cards, and blessed their coming home.
וזה רגע מרגש נורא שיונתן ואסתר הם בבית, חזרו הביתה, כמה טוב שהם באו הביתה. על זה אומרים שהחיינו וקיימנו, הגיענו לזמן הזה.
Finally, as for what comes next, the Pollards will now remain in quarantine in a Jerusalem apartment that's been fully furnished and prepared ahead of their arrival. To begin, early Tuesday morning in Israel was marked by red alert sirens blaring for the second time in a week, as yet another rocket was fired at Israel from the terror group-governed Gaza Strip. The IDF reporting that the projectile was fired towards Kibbutz Kerem Shalom near the southern Israeli border with Egypt and Gaza. And the rocket failed to cross the border, however, instead landing somewhere within Gazan territory. And this after the IDF responded to rocket attacks over the weekend by striking rocket manufacturing sites, underground infrastructure, and a military post, all run by the Hamas terror group. The threat's never ending, though, as meanwhile, militant groups in the Strip begin a large-scale military drill. And 12 armed organizations are involved, including from Fatah and terror groups Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The aim of the drill, to send a, quote, message of deterrence to Israel. All right, moving on from one crisis to another, the Lebanon-based Iranian proxy terror group Hezbollah is now again threatening revenge against Israel. The terror group leader, Hassan Nasrallah, saying that he still intends to avenge the August killing of a Hezbollah operative in Syria, which has largely been attributed to Israel. And this in addition to swearing revenge over the United States' assassination of IRGC Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani, quote, no matter how long it takes. Then on Sunday, Nasrallah also claiming that they have the means to do so, and that his organization has now apparently doubled its stores of precision-guided missiles over the past year. Israel, on the other hand, continuing to shore up the borders ahead of any potential attack, while continuing to confront Iran and its proxies in the region as promised. In other news, to Israel's north, Syrian news agencies reporting at least 1 killed and 3 others injured in an allegedly Israeli missile strike against military installations outside of Damascus. Syrian military sources adding that air defenses intercepted some of the missiles, but not enough to prevent the damages. Targets reportedly including sites belonging to forces from Iran and Iranian proxy terror group Hezbollah. And this just days before the anniversary of the assassination of IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani, and days after Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah repeated threats against Israel for the killing of Hezbollah and Iranian operatives in Syria earlier this year. This also comes after a strike last week that was likewise attributed to Israel, in which several Iranian militant barracks, missile depots, and missile production facilities were destroyed. Meanwhile, earlier in the day, IDF troops reported an attempted infiltration from neighboring Lebanon. The soldiers apparently firing into the air as one of the suspects crossed a few meters into Israeli territory before then retreating back over the border. No further infiltrations were reported.
A suspect wanted for the murder of a mother of 6 near a West Bank settlement was arrested on Thursday. Esther Horgan, a woman in her 50s, was reported missing last week after she went for a jog near her community of Tal Menashe. Her body was found in a nearby forest with signs of a violent death. In a joint operation by the Shin Bet, Israel Police, the IDF, and Border Police, the Palestinian man was arrested just 24 hours after the body of Esther Horgan was found. Over the weekend, IDF forces mapping the suspect's house in the small West Bank village of Tura to prepare for demolition. Israel security forces typically destroy the family homes of convicted Palestinian terrorists. The IDF posting on Twitter about the arrest, adding that they would continue to defend Israeli civilians from terror. While Israel has had several confrontations with Iranian militants in Syria, both confirmed and unconfirmed, an attack by Iran on Israel could come from an unexpected place. A prominent IDF spokesman saying an attack is likely to arise not through Syria, but Yemen or Iraq. Brigadier General Hidai Zilberman told a Saudi news website that these war zones are secondary battlefields for the Islamic Republic, after Syria and Lebanon, of course. Zilberman adding that Iran has developed a wide range of capabilities in these areas, including drones and advanced missiles. He described the Iranian threat to Israel as a, quote, powder keg liable to explode, without going into detail about past hits or Israel's plan for future deterrence. One of Israel's neighbors is looking for a better relationship. Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan telling reporters after Friday prayers in Istanbul that the one thing standing in the way of that is the Palestinian issue, which he called unacceptable. While maintaining intelligence ties, the president citing his disappointment in top-level Israeli officials, saying that without those disagreements, ties could have been very different. The two countries fell out back in 2018, expelling ambassadors over Israel's treatment of Palestinians, but have maintained commercial contact.
İsrail'in Filistin politikalarını kabul etmemiz mümkün değil. İsrail'in Filistin'deki kardeşlerimize karşı takındığı tavrı kabul etmemiz mümkün değil. Onun oradaki acımasız davranışları ve Filistin topraklarına yönelik takındığı tavırları kabul etmemiz mümkün değil. Bu bizim ne adalet anlayışımıza ne ülkelerin toprak bütünlüğüne yönelik yaklaşım noktasında bizim İsrail'le ayrıştığımız noktadır. Yoksa biz gönlümüz arzu eder ki onlarla da münasebetlerimizi daha iyi bir noktaya taşıyalım.
Moving on, Israel's Rafael defense contractor claiming to be changing the face of modern warfare with its latest set of newly unveiled technologies, including weapons, drones, and even a robotic dog. And the new products were displayed on Sunday, with Rafael planning to sell the new lineup to both the IDF as well as to other foreign militaries. So what's in the new catalog? Well, among the standouts are small drones that can fly inside buildings, map the structure, and locate potential threats, robotic dogs that can similarly infiltrate and explore hard-to-access locations, and a largely autonomous artificial intelligence system that enables these devices to operate practically independently of their human handlers. But perhaps the most important new development produced by Rafael is the smart trigger mapping and communication system, which allows for rapid sharing of intelligence practically in real time between units. Rafael's CEO, Yoav Har-Even, explaining that soon all of the capabilities of intelligence collections, data analysis, and assault will be made accessible not only to aerial forces, but also to ground forces, down to the level of the infantrymen. Now, on another note, some Israelis may be asking themselves why they're now heading back to elections over the failure to pass a budget when Knesset members are now suddenly proving themselves more than capable of passing an interim budget, practically overnight. Chana Rifkin with the story.
We can't agree on a budget. Now perhaps the biggest lie in government, as the Knesset gives final approval for an interim financial package Monday night. The outline, increasing government spending in the absence of a true budget and linking the so-called continuing budget to the rate of population growth, as opposed to the consumer price index. And this effectively increasing next year's provisional budget by 4.5 billion shekels for a total of 419 billion or $130.2 billion. But to get the provisional budget passed, some major concessions had to be made. Finance Ministry sources telling Ynet News that several religious MKs conditioned their support on the preserving of stipends for yeshiva students, and this forcing cuts to the provisions for education, health, welfare, and more. Meanwhile, with a sort of budget out of the way, various political parties are still forming and reforming ahead of March elections. And among the latest overnight changes, Acting Defense Minister Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party continuing to bleed members. In addition to the resignation of senior lawmakers, including Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi, Justice Minister Avi Nissenkorn, and Science Minister Yizhar Shai, Blue and White MK Michal Kotler-Wunsch is now the latest to announce that she will not be running on the Blue and White ticket, though she says that she is still committed to serving with courage and humility. As for Gantz's former partner Yair Lapid and his oppositional Yesh Atid party are reportedly in talks to split from the Telem party under former Defense Minister Ya'alon. and to potentially partner instead with former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, who resigned from politics in 2019. This after the Zionist Union, of which she was part, was unilaterally dissolved by Avi Gabay, the then head of the Labour Party. And speaking of new partnerships, Tel Aviv Mayor Ron Huldai is now announcing that he too will be starting a new party for the coming vote, aimed at attracting the, quote, hundreds of thousands of Israelis who feel they have no home in the current political system. The New Hope party, started by former Likud member Gideon Sa'ar, on the other hand, is now unveiling its first primary campaign promise: to limit the prime minister to a maximum term of 8 years in office.
All right, now as Israel's government looks to reform for the fourth time in 2 years, you might be thinking, I can do better. And maybe you're right. But if you're serious about taking on the future, you'll need to know how to do so responsibly and sustainably, especially in the post-COVID era. And that's where a new international program at the IDC Herzliya comes in. In a brand new double major program, the famed international program of the IDC University in Herzliya is now showing the next generation of students what it takes to shape the future. And specifically, the newly updated Sustainability and Government program gives graduates a competitive advantage in both the private and public sectors in areas where policy and decision-making need to be balanced with international issues relating to the environment, economy, and society at large.
Through sustainability, we can provide the developmental needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
Well, recent graduates of the program, including Duna Cousins of Spain and Alexandria Cohen from the US, who partnered after meeting at IDC to create Hydria Water Innovations, a company focused on brokering sustainable and cost-effective solutions for water use and distribution. And Dean of the Double Major program, Professor Yoav Yair, goes on to explain how the program itself drives just such entrepreneurial action.
Graduates of the Double Major in Government and Sustainability will have the skills necessary to work in Israel or abroad and will be well suited to employment in government, the public sector, and relevant NGOs. The study program places a strong emphasis on practical experience through internships and a practicum, enabling graduates of the program to fit into startups in the areas of sustainability or clean tech, or to be sustainable experts in the private and public sectors.
But of course, don't just take my word for it. Students at IDC themselves describing their incredible education.
החיבור בין קיימות, יזמות ועסקים זה משהו שלגמרי הרווחתי בתוך המרכז הבינתחומי, ואני מאוד שמחה שבחרתי במסלול הזה.
העובדה שאני יכול לפנות למרצה שלי ולהעלות איזשהו רעיון והיא תעזור לי לממש אותו, זה משהו שמאוד מאפיין את הבינתחום.
By the way, we just learned in the last few hours that Israel is actually expected to receive 1 million doses of that Moderna vaccine as soon as next week. Moving on now, despite its ups and downs, 2020 had at least one positive statistic for Israel. According to the IDF, it was the safest year for Israelis recorded in the past decade. A new IDF report says although 2020 saw a lower number of terror attacks compared to past years, there was a rise in what the army called the war between the wars, which is covert and open military operation against enemies abroad, mainly Syria and Iran. In Gaza, since January, militants in the Strip fired 176 projectiles into Israeli territory, 90 of them landing in open areas. The Iron Dome missile defense system intercepted 80 out of the 86 rockets that were heading toward populated areas, giving the system a 93% success rate. Over the past year, almost 300 military targets in Gaza were attacked by the IDF. One underground terror tunnel along the Gaza border was uncovered this year, which apparently was dug by Hamas and crossed into Israeli territory. The army also confiscated 541 firearms and 330 knives in 2020, compared to just 603 guns and 521 blades in 2019. One last fact, the military reported that in 2020, it foiled 10 attempts to cross the border from Lebanon into Israel.
Now, speaking of sustainability, a new breakthrough may soon be the nail in the coffin for many dangerous chemical fertilizers. Israeli scientists discovering that plants native to desert regions can find more than enough nutrients from within the dust in the atmosphere. In fact, according to the researchers at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev, plants like wheat and chickpeas even adapt themselves for such a scenario by growing more hairs on their leaves when they're short on phosphorus, which is necessary to support all living things. And the hairs in question work by trapping moisture in the air, which then traps dust particles full of phosphorus. And finally, the leaves ooze an acid that breaks down the phosphorus into a form useful to the plant. Meanwhile, in another experiment with lettuce, plants starved of phosphorus but then sprinkled with desert dust doubled in size without ever touching soil. Authors of the study explaining that this knowledge could potentially lead to a massive reduction in the use of chemical phosphate fertilizers known to be horrendous for the environment. All right, for our final story tonight, once again, Israeli star Gal Gadot and her co-stars setting box office records over the weekend as the long-awaited sequel, Wonder Woman 1984, premieres worldwide. In a joint theater and HBO Max release, Wonder Woman 1984, the second film in the franchise, debuting to massive acclaim over the Christmas holiday weekend. In total, the film grossing upwards of $85 million globally to date. And now, of course, this pales in comparison to the earnings of 1984's predecessor, which earned over $103.2 million on its opening weekend in the United States alone. But given the pandemic, which has shuttered most theaters since March of this year, it seems that Warner Brothers still has more than enough to celebrate. This as the film starring Gal Gadot, Chris Pine, Kristen Wiig, and Pedro Pascal sets the 2020 record for box office profits. Then finally, saving the best news for last, Warner Brothers Studios on Sunday announcing that it'll be fast-tracking the third film in the Wonder Woman franchise, with lead actress Gal Gadot and director Patty Jenkins reprising their respective roles. That said, don't get too anxious just yet, as Jenkins in 2019 expected the wait for the third installment to be even longer than the 2 years between the first and second film releases. In other news, with the end of the year ahead, the Israeli Defense Forces are showing the world some beautiful highlights from 2020 in its annual photography contest. And with 16,000 votes received, here are the winning top 5. Coming in at 5th place is Yoav Klein's photo entitled Walnut, depicting 2 soldiers from the Oketz K9 unit. Next, in 4th place, Tamar Shemtov's Training for the Rescue Brigade, showing a soldier cutting through debris. Then in 3rd, an emotional moment captured by Lev Arpishkin, the swearing-in ceremony for new Golani Brigade fighters who were injured just before in a February terror attack at their Jerusalem training compound. And then finally, taking both 1st and 2nd place out of some 20 different submissions is photographer Amit Argonov, with this incredible shot of Unit 669 soldiers training in the Sea of Galilee coming in 2nd, and this dramatic image of Unit 669 soldiers in another exercise coming in 1st. And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.